There are usually three reasons a retailer ends up having a serious conversation about supply chain. The business is in trouble, the business has grown faster than the operation can handle, or the business is performing but leadership knows that what got them there won't necessarily get them where they're going. In every case, the conversation ends up in the same place. Not just a technology problem, not just a staffing problem, a fundamental question about whether the operation is actually built for the business it's trying to be. Today on Retail Untangled, I'm joined by Peter Jones, founder and managing director of Prological Consulting, someone who has sat inside that conversation more times than most across some of Australia's most recognisable retail businesses at every stage of the journey. We're going to get into what retail supply chain actually demands right now, why automation is both the opportunity and the trap, and what it takes to build an operation that grows with the business rather than holding it back. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, Amie. Great to be here.
Nice to have you. Let's get straight into it. So when a retailer's supply chain is quietly holding the business back, and before anyone admits it, how do they actually know that there's a problem and why do they call you?
Typically what will happen is things in the business will get out of balance. So what could happen is they'll see a big spike in one of the key elements that the CFO will constantly be monitoring. So they'll be monitoring warehouse labour, import costs, inventory on hand, transport costs. So they will, generally speaking, if everything is operating as it ought to be operating, then those things will be reasonably stable 1 week to the next, 1 month to the next, one season to the next. And the CFO will know of seasonal changes as they come along. One of the first things that will happen is the CFO will notice there's something here is trending as it ought not be. So
we don't want that.
Yeah, correct. We don't want that. So, inventory on hand, stock on hand is significantly higher than it should be. So the CFO will be asking a question, why is stock on hand much higher than it ought to be? Or warehouse labour costs have all of a sudden spiked. What's going on down in the warehouse at ours? So it'll be something like that generally will spark a question being asked. The presented issue that the CFO will see, that may not actually, though, be root cause. It'll be where the problem has manifested itself. Root cause to the problem is often 2 or 3 layers underneath the presented issue.
Makes sense. And I suppose on the flip side, there's probably warning signs from a consumer perspective as well, right?
Well, they'll hear from customer service as well. So if there's all of a sudden a change in customer service, so some of those things can be all of a sudden we've got an increase in multiple orders to customers. So that would suggest, there could be a few things going on there. The warehouse is a bit out of control. We couldn't find something. We knew that it was here, so we sent what we could and would find the rest later, and then we sent that. Or inventory's not right for some reason. So we've got some of that order here. We're supposed to have all of it, but we don't. And the rest of it turned up, 3 days later, a week later. And so that got sent out again. Hopefully the customer got communicated as to what was going on in the meantime. So that can be one of the indicators as well of what's going on. Or something's not quite right.
Not quite
Customer
right.
services, yeah. And it's really looking for changes. Business will get into a mode, and if it's growing well and it's going to its business plan, and then they see all of these numbers coming through, the CFO and the COO will generally be watching those things. And while they're pretty stable, they'll be reasonably happy, unless they've got the ambition to go from good to great, but they'll be reasonably happy. So they're looking for changes.
Now, good to great. So you talk about the ant to elephant challenge, rapid growth without re-engineering the operation to match.
Yep.
What breaks first, and why do retailers wait so long to address it?
Yeah, so look, retail is a fascinating industry. And what I've found, I've been doing business consulting around supply chain for 30 years. So just based on my observations, what I see is each business that we go in has a personality and a character of its own. And then within industry sectors, they also have then personalities and characteristics that are normative for that industry. And then each business within that sector will have its own subset of personalities and characters. The retail industry, particularly when you get into fashion, is largely driven by creative, artistic people. They're all over colour, style, etc., etc. Supply chain is science with an element of art over the top of it. So there's one element of it that they just find really hard work to get interested in. as making a generalization as an industry.
Mm-hmm.
So you call a marketing meeting and we're going to do some preliminary work on, now being, what are we, August? So we might be doing some preliminary work for next winter's range. Everyone will be all excited about that. But if we got the merchandise team together and wanted to build heads with them as to why we've got so much inventory in the warehouse and how did they order so much that we can't sell, and we're at the end of winter and we've got all of this stock still here, and we've got science and numbers and all of that, they'll be bored silly, will not want to engage, and very difficult to get them to change behaviour going forward.
It's a very different conversation.
Very different conversation. So that's the first thing that is difficult. So it's a challenge because supply chain operates in the world of science to a large extent. And when we get into retail, it is driven, and the companies that are successful are generally successful, not necessarily because of the application of science, but some other characteristic and giftedness and skill that some creative people had. And now they've become successful. And now they need some science to augment the very thing that they've created. So we talk about the ant to elephant. Ants are phenomenal. So if I were an ant capability, I could run 100 meters in about 7 seconds carrying a small car. That's what an ant can do. But unfortunately, ants don't scale that capability as they get bigger, say, to an elephant. So the business that starts out has a lot of characteristics of an ant. It's small, it's nimble, it's flexible, it can do amazing things. But the very fact that it then operates that way leads to success, and that success will kill it if it stays an ant. It needs to be re-engineered. And so what we see is a lot of businesses try and evolve rather than go back and re-engineer as they go through different phases of their growth cycle. And so what we end up with is
many Band-Aids.
Lots of Band-Aids end up on, and quite often you got to peel those off to find out what's really going on. Yes, but we often see something the size of an elephant that's got 6 legs that look like ants' legs, and the whole thing is shaking and vibrating under the pressure, alive, functioning, but barely.
And that does make sense. So without naming names, because I could imagine you really would not like to, walk us through a retailer whose supply chain was genuinely holding the business back. What did it look like when you arrived, and what was, I suppose, the commercial difference on the other side?
Yes. So look, when I read this question, I thought straight away of a great case study. So there's a business that we've just finished moving them out of a small warehouse in southern Sydney to another larger warehouse. The CFO there was a friend, and he was the CFO at a previous client. So he got in there and said, I don't know what's wrong here, but this isn't right. All of the numbers just don't seem right to me. Peter, can you come and have a look? So I went and had a look, and within 5 minutes of being there, I could see the culture of this place. So a couple of young guys, they'd got onto something good. They'd gone from nothing to around $40-50 million a year in turnover in a reasonably short period of time. By the skin of their teeth, and you go, wow, that's great. They've gone from nothing. They've created a retail network nationally. They've created a great online business. They've got some concession stores happening in the appropriately branded stores to have a concession store. So all of that's looking great. And I got out of the car and walked around to where the front door is, which was adjacent to the warehouse opening. And there is just stuff absolutely everywhere, inside, outside. If you needed to move a pallet from inside to outside, you needed to move other things to do that. And then when I got inside was equally representative of that chaos. Now, the 2 or 3 people that were sort of controlling all of that, they more or less knew where things were, but the time it took to do anything, to get product that had been imported, sorted out, what needed to stay, what needed to be moved on, get it put away into pick slots, etc. It just took forever. So the labour cost was high. The bigger implication for them was they literally could not grow anymore running that sort of systems, processes in that facility. So they took on the decision to go to a bigger facility. We did a relay for them and got some good flows happening from their inbound, put away, picking, staging, outbound, still within, not a big warehouse, but got those things sorted out really, really well for them. I spoke to the CFO just the other day. How things going? He said, we cannot believe it. We're hitting better numbers than what we had in our forecasts because that we're here, and their online business has taken back off again because they're able to meet their online service commitments, whereas previously it was all over the place.
Yeah.
And nothing surer than online today. I mean, you're not even competing online anymore with the local market. You're competing globally. So unless
So true.
yes, and for the customer, a bad experience is very, very easy to fix. I'll just go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so that's the cycle that they were in. And by sorting that out, they've unlocked the supply chain capability of the business, which can now help support the business plan.
Which it would be so interesting to understand the impacts that has on retention, with cost of acquisition being so high.
Absolutely.
It just makes so much commercial sense. So how long did that, does a project like that take to see success?
It was about 6 months. So we had some talking in the first instance, and we did look at a couple of other options. So there were some options that may have allowed them to stay where they were, but they were capital intensive, and all of the capital was in the rest of the business. So we didn't have that capital access to the capital required. So moving facilities. So once we determined that, then moving facilities, etc. It was probably, we would have change out of 6 months, but it was about 6 months.
Yeah. Okay. So taking a business from good to great on supply chain is a very different conversation to fixing, something that's broken. What does a retailer have to be willing to change that you find they're most reluctant to?
Oh, in businesses that are doing supply chain reasonably well, generally means they have a few fairly switched on scientists already in the business. And so when the so-called, knight in shining armor turns up on the white horse with all of the answers because we're the consultant being brought in by a more senior person to help them fix something that they already know is pretty good, that's always the biggest obstacle.
Not a fan?
Well, there's always hearts to win.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Yes, and we're pretty good at winning hearts. And creating the team. So the first thing is, from our perspective, we cannot go into any business and create lasting benefit unless we create a team that includes their team. We know how the outside world works and how supply chain works from that external perspective really well. Not because we're smarter than anyone else. That's just what our day job is.
That's your job.
That's where we live. And our clients, they live inside the four walls. And it would take us years to get the same experience and knowledge inside that they already have.
They know that better than you do.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so we work very hard at prosecuting that story, which is very real, that if we can't get them fully on board, it's always compromised in our outcomes. But where we get great collaboration and everybody understands we're all pretty smart people here, we've all got something to contribute. And if we can all get that on the table, it doesn't really matter who actually turns up with the little golden nugget. It's the team effort, though, that will create it. And if that team becomes compromised because someone doesn't want to participate in a collaborative manner, that becomes fairly complicated. So that's always the single biggest challenge.
And you'd think complicated and costly to the outcomes.
Oh, absolutely, because that's where compromises sit quite significantly.
That makes sense. Now, the pressure on retail supply chains right now is coming from many directions, I'm sure that you're hearing: cost, labor, consumer expectations, peak season intensity. How much of what retailers are feeling is genuinely new, and how much is the consequence of decisions that aren't made early enough?
Look, retail at this level is really, really difficult to balance. I mean, we're working with one of Australia's largest retailers at the moment and a couple of, mid-tier but good brand retailers as well. For all retail, particularly, again, so I'll go back specifically more to fashion and seasonal product type elements, you're generally working about 12 months in advance in terms of your merchandising ranging, starting your marketing planning, starting your store layout, floor-based merchandising, etc. But the the shockwaves that come into the retail environment can turn up in much shorter timeframes than that. But you're already locked and loaded in terms of, what your planning is for that coming season or the 2 seasons ahead. So firstly, I want to start off by saying in this world, it's really difficult. So let's not pretend that there's some magic silver bullet that some consultant knows it's going to fix everything. That is not the case. It is hard. The keys to success of this is to maintain really good flexibility and very detailed knowledge of all of the elements of your supply chain that are there, so that you can pivot quickly. And part of pivoting quickly is to build in structures that are flexible rather than fixed and rigid, and that more they can flex without significant increases in cost is all the better. So there's some general principles. So what does all of that mean in the reality of the world? Well, one of the things is, let's take fuel at the moment. So, the USA decides it's going to go and sort Iran out on behalf of the rest of the world. And all of a sudden, the Strait of Hormuz gets closed and all of our fuel goes up significantly. So within Australia, fuel makes up around about, on average, somewhere around 20 to 25% of freight costs. So if it's just metropolitan only, it's about 10%. But if we're sending things interstate, it's about 30 to 35%. So on average, we're around 20 to 25% on our costs there. For a retailer, freight alone could be 3 or 4% of their costs, which have now gone up by 25%, which is another 1%, 1.5%. Could be the impact on a retailer just from fuel alone across the whole business. That's quite material. You talk, $40 million business, we're talking $400,000 at 1%. That's a lot of money. And most business owners of a $40 million business don't have a spare $400,000 just sitting there in case, somebody in the USA decides to go on and buy Iran all of a sudden. So that's really difficult to deal with and get that locked in. So, that's just tough. And so working closely with your transport providers, trying to find efficiencies elsewhere, doing some of that reengineering work. The worst thing is to go and belt your partner over the head and steal their profit, because you may well drive them out as well because they're all running on their bones as well. From a labour perspective, well, labour continues to get more expensive, but in retail now it's getting more complicated than that. So I go back, I think the retail industry over the last few years has done a really good job of training customers about how the sales season works, moving into Black Friday sales, Cyber Monday, and then we go straight into Christmas. So years ago, we all knew that the sales season was coming. And so that season, the peak of that season would be much higher than normal, but reasonably flat for many weeks. And so what retailers would do is they would bring people in September, October, start to train them up so that when the peak hit, they've got the casual resources to deal with a peak above their permanent staff. And then they can let them go after Christmas. But what has happened is because the retail industry has trained their customers so well, we're no longer buying over that 4 or 5 week period. We're waiting till the last minute. And so the total volume through the sales season in the last couple of years has stayed the same, but it's happened over days instead of weeks. The labour consequence of that is that businesses for a few years have been spending money training people that then they've not been able to employ because the sales orders have not been coming through in their traditional process. So then they're letting these people go and then they can't get them when the new peak has hit. And so that's been expensive as everybody's learnt what this new process is and difficult to respond to if you're in a manual environment. And this is so we'll move quickly to automation. So one of the things about automation is it can work 24/7. And you don't have stepped changed costs for every order that goes through with your automation. So if you're typically running your warehouse 10 or 12 hours a day with automation, peak season comes, a couple of people, and you run it for 16 hours, or you run it for 20 hours, or you run it 24/7 for a few weeks. But you don't need another 100 people in the warehouse to do that. You might need another 10 people in the warehouse to do it, and you just sweat your asset longer. And that provides the flexibility, which then helps to contain those peak labour elements that you want. That works well within the warehouse environment. In the store environment, it's just it's a big challenge, and again, I dare say that most retailers would have far more ideas, positive ideas about how to manage that challenge, actually at the front end of the retail environment than I might have. But in the back end, it's about having a plan. If you haven't started on it, it's time to start, is to mitigate that requirement for peak staffing levels during the sales season, and then to augment that plan back into your normal activity and be removing headcount out of your supply chain costs where possible. And today, automation's quite accessible for very, very small companies. So that's been the big change in automation in the last 3 or 4 years.
Which is a good thing. I feel like we were always ending up at automation. So we could argue that it's potentially an opportunity and the trap. What does it take to get it right? And what happens to retailers who move before the foundations are properly in place?
Yeah. That's a really insightful question. And if only more people asked that question before they embarked on the journey, we would have far less than ideal automation systems set up within businesses. There's lots and lots of different sorts of automation. So it's just like asking somebody, what sort of car would you like?
Yeah.
Well, that depends if it's just me and my wife and we want something that's got no roof to go up the mountains for coffee on the weekend, as against we've got 5 children and we like going on holidays, twice a year camping, towing the trailer. So firstly, you've got to find, both require a car, but the sort of car that can deal with both of those situations is totally different.
Very, very different.
Within the world of automation, they have some of the best salespeople that exist within the supply chain industry. And they're very, very good at convincing people that are not so au fait with all of the available options that their mousetrap is better than all of the other mousetraps for their particular job. So the first piece of advice, and I say sort of, it's a bit self-effacing here, is you are best to be getting independent advice on your automation. It's a huge cost, whether you OpEx it, which is part of what makes it accessible for small companies, or you CapEx it. It turns out to be a significant cost that you're spending. And whilst even a not quite right solution will probably bring advantage, you could well be leaving much more on the table than what it would have cost to have got some good advice in the first instance.
Yeah, and the opportunity cost as you grow.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, for the scalability. And we were just at somebody this morning, which is looking at 12 to 15% year on year for the next decade. And in their case, it's got validity, that sort of growth. And so you look at an automation system that would be appropriate for them today, and that's a very different structure to something that can evolve with them going into that future. Yeah, so the first thing is independent advice. The second thing is automation is not just about getting a better profitability within the business by reducing my OpEx costs, by reducing headcount. Actually, an automated warehouse has a different type of person that is ideal to work in it than a manual warehouse. Manual warehouses have lots of people interaction going on, just walking up and down aisles, getting to the dispatch area, going and getting my orders organised, gathering around the mobile data terminals, etc. Lots of interaction. And so lots of little comments and things go on. In an automated warehouse, people are usually focused on one task, and they do that task for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, whatever the tact time is that they're running on their process, not interacting with anybody else. Now, there's a whole cohort of people out there in the world, I don't understand this, but they love just being left alone, let me do my job, don't want to talk to anybody. They're the people that work best in an automated warehouse. Those people will not work well in a highly social, interactive environment of a manual warehouse, as the people in a traditional manual warehouse often find it difficult to transfer across to an automated work environment. It changes significantly. So there's a big HR piece there to consider. And then you've also got to have an IT platform that supports it all. So automation will allow your product to move faster with higher levels of control. But if you don't have the systems to be able to leverage that well, you actually are, again, compromising the possibility of what could have happened. And we see this regularly happen. Budgets get set $5 million to do something, and we get to $4.5 million and it's not finished, and someone wants an extra $500,000, they just get told, no, you can't have it. But in doing that, we often see you end up with only 60 or 70% of the capability of the system because that stretch wasn't made to actually implement it properly. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, they spend multiples of what they should have spent in the first instance in extending that original budget. And I guess that's the other thing. These programs of work always cost more than what gets budgeted.
Budget more.
Absolutely. They just always do. So, yeah.
That makes sense. So pure play e-commerce and omnichannel are very different supply chain challenges. Where do pure play retailers most commonly get it wrong?
We're seeing pure play ones now. There's really good benchmarks now exist in the world with the pure play. So we've got Amazon as a global benchmark, and in Australia we've got the Iconic as a pure play as well. Both of those are world leading in what they do. So if you go back 5 years ago, for somebody setting up a pure play online, what do I need to do was a question, because it wasn't evident. But we've all been on the end of Amazon and the Iconic and a couple of other key pure play online retailers to know what good needs to look like. So if you're alive in that space, chances are you're not doing too much wrong. As you mentioned earlier, the cost of acquiring a customer is huge, very, very easy to lose, and almost impossible to get back. So if you're starting out now or fairly new in the game, if you're not getting it right, you're just not going to be there, because
it's too expensive.
So many are getting it right now. So, I remember a few years ago, I used to say that the key to a pure play online was that there's 3 elements, that they're like a stool, and the stool doesn't work if one leg is longer or shorter than the other 2 legs. They've got to be in balance. And the 3 stools are that your marketing is working really well to get somebody to come and have a look at your digital interface. Your digital interface needs to be consistent with the marketing story they got sold. And then the fulfillment process needs to be consistent with the digital experience I had, which was consistent to the marketing experience I had. So I used to say, just those 3, they just need to be consistent, and then you'll be reasonably okay. But today that's no longer the case, because the standard now has been set by those big brands who are just doing it really, really well. So the big danger is underestimating how important it is to get those things right. And, there are so many layers to what you need to get right. Firstly, even those big players, things don't always go 100%. So that communication process to the customer, keep them informed, absolutely critical. And that will buy you grace a couple of times, maybe.
Possibly.
But if you haven't got it, you'll be dead. And because the customer has so many other options available, it's almost in their good grace that they're buying from you, because there are plenty of alternatives for most products today. Yes, so that was talking about business to customer pure play. Bricks and mortar pure play customers, I think they're going to really struggle as well moving forward at some scale. So there may be a specialist boutique that exists on a high street within a tourist area, for example, Hastings Street in Noosa, or they're in Mackerson Street in Port Douglas, and they're a one-off. They will probably go okay if they've got something very, very special in their store in that sort of environment. But to now have a national network of bricks and mortar without also supporting that with online, I think that's going to be a very difficult play going forward. There is so much commercial advantage in being able to move your inventory from one mode to the other mode. And that provides such a big advantage that if somebody doesn't have that, it's difficult to see how they could be sustainably competitive within their market sector. Now, I should say all of that knowing that if you're really small and got a very specific niche, you've got a much better chance. But, if you're running 20, 30, 40 stores nationally, you're going to really struggle against somebody else that's omni-channel versus bricks and mortar only at that scale.
Now, the consumer, they never see the supply chain. They see the promise, the communication when something goes wrong and whether, what arrived match what they ordered. At what point does a supply chain failure stop being an operational problem and start being a brand problem?
Oh, I think today it's a brand problem as soon as something's gone wrong.
Sad, but true.
Absolutely, because there are just so many now that get it so right. So again, there are so many options. It is so easy to plug into now. I mean, we have one big national company now that is providing online fulfillment within a 3PL environment with fantastic automation, really strong systems. They are directly plugged into national network of distribution. That's perfectly aligned for business to customer distribution. If you're a small player, you can just go and do an arrangement with that particular company and you are going to get really, really good logistics fulfillment. Then your only job in being a startup is you've got to get that digital interface happening and you've got to get your marketing happening so people come and visit your digital interface. But the supply chain piece, even for small companies, can get plugged into quite easily at that front end. So that brand problem is because of a failure. And people, when they have a failure against a particular order, it's not something generally they keep to themselves either. So that amplification of the problem will escalate very quickly.
And we're seeing those things getting louder and louder.
Yeah, well, we have boosters, influencers, frustrated dads that couldn't get his lawnmower blades or mum that couldn't get what she wanted for kids off to school or whatever the story happens to be. So I would think now that failure in supply chain for anybody in retail is a brand issue nowadays. It's not a case of you can get away with that. And here's the line. The line is failure is a problem at any level.
At any level, which is hard. And
absolutely,
tough, right?
Yes. But it is where our standard has gone. And when you look at those brands I mentioned earlier and what they're doing, they very rarely fail. And their communication is excellent. So even when something's not right, you will probably know about it before you're expecting fulfillment. And whilst that might be frustrating in the moment, it does by grace. And because they don't fail often, you're unlikely to have that experience next time.
You're still getting your 9 out of 10 orders between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m. The next day delivery. So it's A-OK.
Yes.
Now, the customer relationship in retail is increasingly digital. So obviously, a lot more people are shopping online, but the physical act of fulfillment is still what delivers on it. How do you get a retail leadership team to see those two things as connected rather than separate functions?
Yeah, so with it becoming increasingly digital, as I've been doing some research recently on large retailers around the world. So we've been looking at Marks and Spencer. We looked at Harrods and Suffrages in the UK, John Lewis, Marks in the USA, Bloomingdale's. We also looked at Walmart, which is in a different sort of price point to all of those other brands, as well as the two big Australian ones with David Jones and Myer. And it seems fairly typical that those sorts of retailers are targeting around 20 to 25% of their sales volume being digital. Mm-hmm. And I'm still trying to work out why that seems to be a sweet point. So obviously somebody's been doing some research on it because they're all sort of targeting that same sort of range, around 20 to 25%. So when we say increasingly difficult, that seems to be the target point for those big retailers. For smaller retailers, I'm not quite sure where that sort of where that marker might sit. And there could be a science sitting behind that 25% that suggests that that's universal across the line. Where things have happened in the last few years, the connection or disconnection between digital and the physical is the transition has taken place, where digital has come into thinking and into the sphere of decision making. And because people realize we have to be in this game in order to continue to play well, it has had lots and lots of focus. And so so when you walk into the C-suite room, the digital has had a lot of the decision making and a lot of investment over the last few years. And if we look into even the big Australian retailers and read their annual reports, the most recent ones you can get hold of, and other public information. The big investment in the last few years has been on their digital side of their business. It's interesting that David Jones in the last 2 years, whilst investing in that heavily, has also been investing in some of their more flagship stores, particularly a couple here in Sydney, one in Melbourne, to be lifting that in-store experience as well. So I think, the balance point has been that you've got to have both of those engines working really, really well for you. The bricks and mortar element that's evolving. So what I went and did with my mum 30 years ago in a bricks and mortar environment, that's not going to cut it with the consumer today. But there still is an experience that you cannot get anywhere else other than going to the store. And so the C-suite can't afford to take their eyes off that in-store experience. At the same time, they need to be nailing that digital experience, which starts with the marketing, goes through the digital interface and ends up with fulfillment.
Yeah.
That just has to be working as close to 100% to your customer promise as possible. So I think the bricks and mortar side of things, it's difficult in the C-suite. They've now got two balls they need to keep their eye on, and both of them have to be working. They need to be kept in balance. If one of them fails, that will lead to brand problems, which will then pollute the other one as well. So,
we've seen
it's
difficult. A lot of that lately.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of that lately. What's the honest reason most supply chain transformation efforts stall, don't work, or fail? Probably all different reasons.
Yeah, the first reason can quite often be that we solved a problem that didn't quite nail. We presented a solution that didn't quite nail the problem. And so we didn't actually understand really what was required, or we took on too much risk with something that looked really good on PowerPoint and Excel, but we've now not been able to translate it into reality, or that we didn't understand the future well enough, because supply chain transformations takes a long time.
Yeah.
And so if there's too much design work done around the current, by the time it turns into reality, it's already old. So that is a transformation problem. The recognition of how much effort it takes at a personnel level, and that it just takes a while. So people have got to be fairly bloody minded to stay the course to see it through to the end with the same enthusiasm 2 years down the track as what we had when we started out.
Yeah.
And then, as we sort of mentioned earlier as well with automation, you've got to be able to support the initiatives that you decided on financially. Because if you don't, you end up having compromised, not wasted necessarily, but compromised a lot of effort and investment already made. And you're also significantly compromising tomorrow. And always when we see programs of work cut short financially, the cost of that far outweighs what would have been the case had they just doubled down and got it finished in the first instance. And so we're always encouraging people to do that. And again, coming back to external advice is going to give you a much clearer idea of what reality is, rather than going straight to whatever the supplier base is to deliver the components of the transformation. External advice will get you closer to the land of reality.
All right. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this. What does a genuinely future-ready retail supply chain look like, and how far away are most retailers from building one?
Oh, wow.
Here's a test.
What a question. What a question. I did some thinking of this, so it sort of it let my mind have a blank sheet of paper as to the possibility. Look, there are so many elements that have been talked about for years in supply chain that, again, I'll come back to, are real in PowerPoint, and you can make them dance in Excel. But to get them to all work in parallel is really, really complicated. But the ideal supply chain is where you actually know what your customer demand is going to be, and you can feed that all the way back to your suppliers with the appropriate lead time, that it lands where your customer is exactly when they wanted to buy it. So, I'll use an example of, we might sell 3 pair of ankle height brown woolen socks in Australia each year. And we've got metadata that says that's the pattern, that's what happens. Where do those socks need to be at the right time? So I don't want 6 pair because now I'm carrying 2 years inventory. I don't want 2 pair because I've missed a sale. I don't want to find out that they were all sold in Victoria and Tasmania, but I've landed them in Perth and Sydney because now I'm got land transport that if I'd figured out to land them in Victoria and Tasmania, I'd be a lot closer to the customer. So all of those things in theory can be worked out. The challenge is getting it all to dance together at one time. And the perfect supply chain, ideal supply chain, an interesting thought is, does it really exist?
I was just about to say that.
Does it really exist?
It's a journey, not a destination.
Correct, yes. Because things change so quickly. We're finding in our own office now, even with AI coming on. Firstly, we've learnt it's not a panacea to all of the problems that we have. It's a tool. So it's
Very
like
much
when we
so.
first got introduced to Excel and we moved away from our 3-column cash book with carbon paper, and we all thought, how good is Excel? AI is just the same, and at the moment it's special. It will be just normal and another part of the toolkit that we use moving forward. But if we can harness that tool, its capability in supply chain is phenomenal, particularly around anything that requires a predictive element.
Yeah.
It will be quite good. So we talk about supply chain in that we actually say there are no perfect supply chains. So the key to getting it as best you can is to understand all of your compromises and then choose the compromises that you can best live with over the horizon that we're planning for. But moving forward, you have to have advanced systems. Automation needs to be a part of your toolkit because if you're using people and your competitors using automation, they've got a competitive advantage over their OPEX as well as their ability to turn orders around. So you've got to have some automation. You've got to have a marketing that draws people to your brand. You have to have a digital interface that engages people and keeps them engaged, is easy to use, and moves them down the 1 or 2 channels that you've got to market, either being B2C or through your bricks and mortar. And if you're running both, that digital interface has got to be interfaced to both of those. So I know that if I want this thing and I want to go to the shop, I know that if I go to that shop, it'll be there. Conversely, is it online? When can I have it? And what does that process look like? So there are a few cornerstones that are just absolute, but I think your comment is right. It's ever evolving. Know your compromises and choose the compromises that are going to be least impactful for the future that you see. Supply chain in retail is hard work. Retail is a tough industry to be in. It gets blown around with the wind of macro and microeconomic elements consistently. It's very hard to plan within. So for people that are struggling within the retail world with their supply chain, that is normal. It is a tough place to get it right. But there is help and there are things that can be done every day to make it better. Pursue progress. Don't worry about perfection. And each day, just try and move things in the direction of what your plan is.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Retail Untangled, and a big thank you to Peter Jones from Prological Consulting for joining me on this episode. To be the first to know when the next episode lands, like and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts.